Yung Hee, thank you for speaking with me today. One part of your story starts on October 26th, 1973, in a police station in Seoul, Yeongdeungpo. You were found there abandoned, wearing red pants and barefoot. What can you tell us about this time, this experience? How does your story begin, Yung Hee?
Um, to be honest, I don't have any memories of my time in Korea.
Mm,
I don't actually even remember the airline flight from Gimpo Airport to John F. Kennedy Airport in 1974. Um, so the place where we're starting, October 26, 1973,
mm,
I was found on the street in Yeongdeungpo by a police officer. I was wearing red pants, and I don't know that I was barefoot necessarily, but I think I was wearing socks, but no shoes.
mm,
Um, as I understand it, well, a few people have suggestions of what they think may have happened.
mm,
Um, One Korean friend of mine got the impression from my paperwork, the hanja that's written on there, that I was wearing knitted red pants and bosan, which are indoor socks without shoes.
mm,
Um, Another friend thinks that it's likely that I got lost or wandered off because as if I were an intentional abandonment or relinquishment, that would likely mean preparing the child by fully dressing her and even attaching a note maybe that states the child's name and date of birth and a plea to please take care of her. And I didn't have any of those things. I personally think I got lost or wandered off since I didn't have shoes and it was the end of October. It would have been cold.
mm.
So it makes more sense that I would have wandered off on my own rather than an adult just sending me out that way. When there's also a social study performed by the adoption agency I was adopted through, Social Welfare Society, that noted that I cried when getting scolded for going out of my foster home without permission.
Mm.
So that may establish that I had sort of a pattern of leaving without permission.
How have you come to understand this information? Have you spoken to the police station, or I mean, you said yourself you have no memories of it. So how have you come to garner that information, Young Hee?
Right. I've done a lot to search, and so I've made many friends along the way,
Mm,
both Korean people and adopted people.
mm,
And um, these are just suppositions that they've given me based on like the picture and the hanja that was written in my file. Um, um, I really, like I said, I don't have the memory, so I don't know for sure.
mm,
But they're just best guesses based on the information that I do have. Um, the first time I went back to Korea in 2012,
mm.
that was the first time since I was adopted, and I was so nervous about getting lost. So I think that was something that was deeply ingrained in me from an early age.
Mm.
So I suspect that I was lost.
Uh, for I guess for people listening, Hanja would be the Chinese characters. So in Korea, we use the Korean language Hangul, and we also use Hanzhao. That was more common, I guess. It's especially for names or official documents, people would use
Yes.
the Chinese characters. Um, your your instincts tell you that you were lost rather than perhaps abandoned. I guess the reason why that's important, I think, is because I'm not sure on the exact statistics, but there were quite a few children that were abandoned or taken to police stations, right?
So we think it's hard to know what the truth is.
Yeah.
I have met a very common backstory for Korean adoptees is for their paperwork to say that they were found on the steps of City Hall or on public transportation, like on the train or a bus,
Hmm.
or found on the street, like myself. And that's not to say that wasn't ever the case, but I have met some adoptees who did find their biological families, and it turned out that was completely fabricated. So there is a possibility that it was made up.
Hmm.
Um, in my case, since I think I was lost, and there's very few documents in my adoption file, I think I was just in fact lost, and they didn't bother creating, fictionalizing a story because they could just use what was there in my case.
You've said this took place in 1973, which
Yes.
is, still that's like 8 years before I was born. And even I consider, I was going to say, even I consider myself old, but that wouldn't be perhaps polite. What I would mean to ask you here, Yung Hee, what I'm trying to ask respectfully is, what do you know about the kind of socioeconomic environment we're talking about? Because this story definitely takes place in a real time, in a real place in Seoul. So what do you know about the background or the relative affluence or lack thereof of the area? Or
To be honest, not a whole lot. In the 1970s, Korea, I have a Korean neighbor that used to live near me, who grew up in Korea. And she told me that at that time, Korea was actually doing okay. Not great, but it wasn't quite the war-torn, ravaged city that it was back in the 50s and part of the 60s. Korea, in Seoul anyway, was one of the more metropolitan areas. They had, for example, a train, and it was common for families that were going to abandon their children to take them to bigger cities like Seoul in hopes that the police or the adoption agencies would in fact find the children in the orphanages.
is there an element, so I guess I'm jumping to a different part of a story here. Is there an element that your family was based outside of Seoul? This was a day trip into Seoul, or based in Yeongdeungpo? Do you have any idea about that, Yung Hee?
I don't know at this point. I have some information from my father, but he was not with my mother at the time that I was born and when she raised me. So I don't know those pieces of my story.
Right. After being found in or around a police station, October 26th, 1973, and again, you don't have any memory, but I'm just trying to see how much of the story is being pieced together. You're taken to a Red Cross establishment. You spend a year or so there?
Actually, it was just a few days.
Oh, okay.
It was a temporary missing children's reception center that was set up. And as far as I understand, there was quite a few of these, not necessarily by the Red Cross, but there were quite a few temporary shelters that were set up for missing and lost children. I was found on October 26, 1973, but I wasn't actually entered into the intake paperwork at the Missing Children Center until October 29th, 1973. And I'm not sure where I was for those 3 days in between.
I think one of the things that surprises me so much about this story, Yung Hee, is that however it comes about, you're found around this police station, but then after a certain amount of time, you're marked for international adoption by the Social Welfare Society. 사단 법인 대한사회 복지회. Like, this seems a very quick decision that, you have a missing child, or you have a lost child, or you might have a child that's been placed in with a police station, but then to go from that to be flagged or marked for international adoption, that's a very interesting part of the story, isn't it? Or a very shocking part of the story.
Yeah, that was very quick. I just want to point out that I wasn't actually sent for overseas adoption just yet. It wasn't till about a year later.
Okay.
But the fact that they flagged me, I think, implies that I was up to a certain level of good health, and that I was advanced enough in my development that I could go to a foster home and spend time with them and become potty trained and learn how to feed myself, things of that nature, and also to gain a reasonable amount of weight. So I was somewhat healthy when I went to the United States.
Do you know anything about that year? Were you with just like in Korea before you went to the United States? Were you with one family? Were you in sort of like an institution or a home? I'm not sure of the right words. Forgive me.
Sure, that's fine. I was with a foster family. There was a mother that stayed home and a father who I think worked in an office, and there were some other children there as well. I'm not sure if they were the biological children or other foster children. There's a social study in my adoption paperwork, which is the social worker from my adoption agency observing me in the foster home and taking notes on my development, how I interacted with other people in the foster home, how I was eating and sleeping, things like that. And that seemed to, that she seemed to imply that I was adjusting well, and was on track for going to a home in the United States.
It's quite nice of the foster family. It makes me think like, but you did eventually go to the United States, Yung Hee. Now, my very first guest on this podcast was Dr. Lee Geum Soon, and she worked for the United Nations, the South Korean government. She's a specialist on the idea of international adoption. She's been very critical of South Korea for how she describes it as essentially giving up their children, sending them overseas rather than dealing with it internally. And of course, there are many factors, and it's a very complex story. But do you have any take on the fact that you were sent overseas? And, you know, many South Koreans were sent overseas during this time.
Well, I understand, you know, with the ravages of the war, that they didn't have money for social welfare programs initially. But by the 70s, as I understand it, things were okay. And it is disappointing. It's shameful that the Korean government didn't put social welfare programs into effect. And as I understand it, they're still not that great today. I do feel the Korean government needs to step it up and take care of their more marginalized populations, such as single mothers and young children and the elderly and the disabled.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the research on that subject seems to indicate that it's not so much economic, like the number of children being sent abroad rose at the same time the Korean economy was rising. So it was more related to social stigma or elements of shame or people being unwilling to raise children out of wedlock. That seems to drive a lot of the conversation with the data.
Yes, that's correct.
Before you were adopted by a family in the United States, you were given a name and a date of birth here in South Korea. You know, whenever we go on planes, visas, all of these kind of things, we use our name, our date of birth. How do you feel about the name that you were given during this situation? And I guess the date of birth as well, like Kim Yung Hee. Have you come to accept it as your own? I'm just trying to empathize and try to understand what it must be like to know that the names were given in that kind of process.
Not really. I spent most of my life thinking that that was a name that my family had given me, and I actually came to find out in about 2012 that it was a name that the adoption agency or the orphanage, came up with, and it was just something. You know, it was very common to be named after the orphanage director, for example, or have names picked out of a Korean names book for children. So I don't have any real attachment to it. The interesting thing is lately, with being in contact with my father's side of the family, they call me Kim Yung Hee. And so it's become more, I'm getting more used to hearing it. And I guess I sort of relate to it a little bit in that regard. But it's not, I still hold out for the day when we can hopefully find my mother and she can give us the missing pieces, such as what my name was when I was born. And I would like to change it back to that.
There's a huge period of time between, let's say, 2012, when you discovered that your name was given by this establishment, and 1973. How and when did you come to understand your story? Was it like in your teens? Was it your 20s? How did that all play? How did that all come to light for you, Yung Hee?
My adoptive family was very open about my adoption, so I knew about that from the start. I was free to look at my file, so I, would look over the documentation that accompanied me to the United States. I was, for most of my life, I was sort of in a fog about my Koreanness and my place in the world as an adoptee. It wasn't really until about my 30s, after I'd gotten married and was pregnant with my first child that I had my first reckoning, if you will. And I started really exploring like who I am and where I came from. Adoption for a lot of people is sort of something that you learn to bury, because it's associated with loss and, you know, losing your family and losing everything that's familiar. So adoptees tend to bury that and then just dive right into their new life in America or Europe or wherever their second family has brought them, and to assimilate as much as possible. Sorry, I got a little off track there.
No. I think, I mean, it's incredibly brave. I have a huge amount of respect for being able to look at that part of your story, because it must be incredibly difficult. I have 2 young children myself, and the idea of becoming a parent, I mean, it's a pivotal moment when you question who you are, what's going on, how life is made, even, and what's going on in this existence of life that we do. So it was becoming a mother yourself, I guess, that really, is that right, you think, Yung Hee?
Both getting married, I got married a little on the late side, and then also being pregnant with my first child. For the wedding, for example, we were planning like what guests were going to be there for the bride and the groom side. And my adoptive parents had been divorced for a long time, and I didn't know if they would both come, for example. So my side was looking kind of light. It just got me wondering all kinds of things, and also having my first child or being in the process of growing my first child. Just wondering, you know, that would I ever look into another face that looked like mine, that this would be my first blood relative that I knew of, for example, things like that. For a lot of adoptees, big life events, sometimes going off to college, for example, maybe meeting like other Korean or other Asians for the first time is the big catalyst for sort of waking up and delving into our past lives.
How many children do you have, Yung Hee? Am I allowed to ask that?
Sure, I've got 2. My son is 10 and a half, and my daughter is about to turn 13.
Wow. My 2, a little bit younger, they're 6 and 7. Do you have any advice for having children as they approach teenagers? What have you learned about having 2 kids like that, Yung Hee?
Let them talk as much as they want. Sometimes kids can paddle on and on, but let them talk, because then they're more likely to come to you when they have the big things that they want to discuss, and they know that they can come to you, that you'll listen and they'll be heard.
I believe that's very true, because sometimes kids will talk, and it's sometimes not that interesting. You have to be a good parent and smile. That's very, very real. You just said there, Yung Hee, this idea of, I forget the exact word, but it was like sort of waking up or coming to acknowledge your identity and things like that and your situation. You've spoken in some interviews about your Korean blood and heritage, and that despite your American nationality and I guess white middle class upbringing, there's still part of you, maybe more than a part, that knows it's Korean. Like in Korean, there's very much this sense of kind of uri, which is we, or this kind of 단일 민족, this kind of one blood, one Korean family. Can you try to convey this feeling to us, or explain it, please, this idea that you feel Korean, or there's this pull towards your Koreanness?
Well, a big part of it was, as an adoptee, a transnational and transracial adoptee, I don't look like the family that adopted me. And so all my life, and especially when I was young, people would make comments reminding me the fact that you don't look like your family. So it's hard to ignore the fact that I have an Asian face, even if my family may be white or black or Hispanic. And that was a big disconnect. So over the years, I mean, you just can't get away from it. There's always a sense of being othered, and people reminding you, you don't belong here, you're a foreigner. And that's really hurtful to hear growing up. But what that taught me was that I'm not actually, I didn't completely assimilate into the culture that I was adopted into. I A lot of adoptees when they're younger wish that they were like their families and could look like them and blend in. I understand that, but I never did. So it just comes to a point where you realize that one day, and either you deal with it or you just continue to bury it.
I think one of the reasons I have incredible respect for you, Yung Hee, and other people in similar situations is that we know in society, at school, at high school, sort of this idea of it's bullying, but it's also othering, and this idea of comments and things that go on. But many people would still have, they'd go home to their family and they would find some kind of solace. But in your situation, you have a family, absolutely, but still recognizing yourself to be, you use the words transnational and transracial adoption. So that adds this whole other layer to this, to this experience, which it blows my mind to think that people go through that. What was it like, Yung Hee, searching for answers in terms of getting records from Seoul? So you're based in the United States and you want to try to get information from Korea. Doing my research, it says like from 2008, you get records from the city of Seoul. What was it like dealing with South Korea in terms of getting this information? Was it easy? Was the language a problem? Were they very efficient? Was it done by fax? Or how did that play out, Yung Hee?
Language was definitely a big hurdle. A lot of agencies in the early 2000s even didn't necessarily have websites that were navigable by somebody who's English speaking like myself. For the most part, trying to contact agencies was really difficult because there's only a phone number, and I can't, of course, speak Korean or understand it when it's spoken to me. I did have Korean friends along the way that encouraged me to contact like the mayor of Seoul. And he just turned out to be a really receptive person. There was a website, a Seoul municipal website, where you could email the mayor. And it was surprisingly easy to do at the time. And I was really not expecting a reply from him, but he did reply back to me with the basic information of where I was found and what I was wearing. But since then, and at many other agencies, it's extremely difficult to conduct a search. People just don't get back to you. Records haven't been digitized. There's the runaround. Some people are told that their adoption files were burned in a fire, or that they've been stored in a warehouse and they don't know where they are. What really helps a lot is to have a Korean speaking friend who can make calls for you. And I've been really fortunate in that regard.
That's fascinating, Yung Hee. I never knew that you got your information and it came from Seoul City Hall. Like, so you emailed that. I'm not sure if you know, was the mayor at the time Park Won-soon, or maybe Oh Se-hoon?
Oh Se-hoon.
He was in charge at the time. He's the current, he's the mayor again now.
Again.
Yeah. And so that came from the mayor's office, the first time you understood about the Yeongdeungpo story and the red pants type thing?
Yes.
That's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, because, you find it, but to have it come from such an established body, I think that must be quite pleasing. I don't know. What was it like getting it from the mayor's office?
It was encouraging to know that there was an official record of me, that I existed and, was someone in Korean society.
I wonder, and forgive me if my questions are not appropriate, but I wonder sometimes, is there this element of you don't want to know? Does that ever come? Like, so you're getting this answer and there it's going to give you maybe this email or this letter is going to have some information. Is there ever any part of you that like questions, do I really want to know this? Like, does that ever come into it? Because I feel like for myself, what if it's a bad story, or what if I get the information and nothing changes? Does that play into it at all, Yung Hee?
I'm sure for some people, but for me, I want to know the truth. Good or bad, I want to know the truth, and I want to do everything I can to search for my family, because I just don't know what happened. If I was lost, the idea that my family's been missing me and grieving me all these years, they deserve closure to that. And I deserve closure as well. So it's important to me to find out the truth. I want to be as authentic as possible and understand my origins.
Very well said. You've done quite a bit on Korean media. The Korean media has picked up your story, and this includes sort of newspapers, television, radio. How do you feel about the Korean media's presentation? There might be a language barrier, I guess, but I'm sure you have some sense of it. How do you feel about how the Korean media has presented your story, and what's been your experience with this kind of television and news that's gone on?
I think it's been pretty positive, and I feel like I've been very fortunate. I haven't had to do anything particularly dramatic to get into the eye of the media. I was warned by some adoptees that some television networks will try to play up the emotional factor for their viewership, which I understand, but I haven't actually run across that myself. I actually have a couple of upcoming events that are going to be airing on television. One's a documentary. They'll be following me around in Korea in the fall. And then I'm going to be appearing on an SBS program as well. So I look forward to working with them. They usually have translators, and I've got a very good friend who translates for me on my end. She lives in the United States. And I don't know. I feel pretty good about it. There aren't a lot of options in terms of how else to find my family. So I'm willing to put myself out there and step outside of my comfort zone to do what it takes to try everything I can.
I think it's quite. I think it shows South Korea's development that the major news and media networks are willing to go with this story, because, you know, it's possible it could show Korea in a bad light, and a lot of the time they've been trying to promote themselves as a certain nation. But I think now that they're doing these stories is possibly, you know, a good thing. You mentioned a couple of times this idea of speaking to other adoptees. I've spent some time, I think, with the increase in Hallyu and Korean like success abroad, more and more people they're trying to find out about their Korean origins, and so I've, you know, spent time with these kind of people. One is a psychologist based in Sweden now, and she's going through a similar experience. For the community, Yung Hee, of people, that Koreans that have gone through transnational adoption, is there a community? Is there a shared experience? Is there like this collective understanding, or is every situation individual and unique?
Definitely individual and unique, but there is a shared community. On Facebook, there's a large international population of Korean adoptees, and several large adoptee groups that people, first they'll find the large adoptee groups, and we'll have a general introduction. It may start kind of light, just talking about Korean cooking and, you know, K-pop and a movie or something. Yeah. But there's people that want to delve into deeper topics, such as depression and identity. And those groups, there's tons of subgroups that have filtered off in just about every interest, from, you know, adoptees that play guitar to photography and learning the language. And there's, I think, pretty much something for everybody, or at least the opportunity to create something if you haven't found your niche.
Have you been quite prominent in those groups? Have those groups helped you, or what's the kind of size? I mean, having never seen any of them myself, I'm just trying to get an idea. They have various interests, but like the size of them or the role that they can play in people's lives, or?
Absolutely. I think they try to make them out to be sort of safe spaces. So that's a good way to sort of like stick your toes into the water and get a feel for things. You can make it as light or deep as you want to. It's common for adoptees to get together in similar regions, get together for a meal. And it might be something that's social and kind of light. Some adoptee groups organizations have formed where they hold panels and have conferences and lectures, and they talk about more of the deeper issues, such as, you know, international adoption, the psychological effects of it, your identity, and so on. So there's something for everybody. Back in the early, let's see, 2000s, there wasn't much online, but there was a Yahoo group for Korean adoptees. And I was a little bit active with that, although not super active, but that was my first foray into the online community. In about 2009, I joined Facebook. And I don't know if I just did a search one day, I don't recall, and just looked up to see what Korean adoptee groups there were. But there's a handful of them that are pretty big. We're talking like 5,000 or 6,000, 7,000 people in them.
Wow.
Yeah. And adoptees from all over the world. And it's really a great way to, when you first get in there, it's like, wow, there's somebody that's like me. But over time, you realize, just like any other population, we all have so many differences and individual needs and interests that it's just, there's not something, it's not for everybody, I guess. Some people don't want to delve into issues of identity and so on. And that's okay too. Some people have had really wonderful adoptions, and that's fantastic. But not everybody has. So it's an interesting cross section where people can discuss their differences, sometimes emotionally, discuss their differences and also share their similarities, and to sort of just delve into all things that are Korean, and you can work at your own pace.
I would, apart from talking to you and a couple of other people, I would never have any idea that such groups existed. And so I guess my next question, Yung Hee, would be, for people outside of these transnational Korean adoptee groups, people such as myself, is there anything that people often get wrong about that community or mischaracterize? Is there sometimes like language that's used incorrectly, or misconceptions, or things that are done badly, things that could improve that perception of that group? Yung Hee, I'm asking about from people outside of it.
I think one of the common misconceptions is that if you had a negative adoption experience, that you hate adoption, you're against adoption. That's not always true. There's everybody's situation is so different. And there tends to be a polarization between those that are for adoption, those that are against adoption. And it really doesn't need to be like that. I think we can see a lot more unification in that regard. For me, for example, my adoption was less than ideal, but I feel like in some circumstances, adoption is called for and it can work. There are some amazing families out there that have adopted, and I applaud their efforts, and I'm glad that they were there for those kids. But there's also a lot about adoption that's troublesome and not above board or transparent, and that needs to be rectified.
Especially when it's international, I guess, as well, because that adds that whole other layer to it, doesn't it? With this.
Well, there's that. The concern is it actually for the welfare of the child, or is it to meet the needs of parents who want a family, a certain family that they envision? And the problem is there's so many children that are in adoption in the foster system that don't have homes. What's going on with them? I mean, if you're waiting for a specific child that meets a certain definition that you have in your head, that's more about fulfilling your own needs than trying to help a child that's already out there and needy.
Yeah, I'd never even considered that before. Yung Hee, you just mentioned you're coming to South Korea in the fall. I guess this is jumping from adoption to one of the turning points of your story, but you discovered your father. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
How does that part of the story play out? I mean, because from 1973 until, I guess, quite recently, it's a huge period of time. And then you eventually discover your biological father, your Korean biological father. How does that part of the story play out, Yung Hee?
Last year in May, first of all, I have my DNA registered as many places as I can reasonably have it registered. I'm registered with all the big DNA companies in the United States, 23andMe, Ancestry, and Family Tree DNA. And then there's also some other websites where you can transfer your DNA data. So you'll be in other databases as well. I'm also registered with Korea National Police Agency Missing Persons Database in Korea. The problem is none of these databases are connected. So the only way you can really cover your bases is to be in every database. And that is really important because there have been situations where an adoptee, if they hadn't tested at one particular company, would have missed out on a match to close family. So last May, I got a notification, email notification that I had a second cousin match come up on Ancestry.com. And I was actually a little surprised because at the time, Ancestry didn't have that many Korean people in the database. So I didn't expect a lot of results from Ancestry previously. It turned out that he was a 21-year-old male who's a quarter Korean, and a second cousin of mine, and actually lives not far from me. And so we chatted online for a while, and I told him about my backstory. And he put me in touch with his mom, who's on Facebook. I was able to find her on Facebook, and she and I compared DNA. His mom is half Korean, and she came back as a first cousin. So we're getting a little bit closer to fitting the pieces together. Her mom is full Korean. So the young man's grandmother is full Korean. And with some time, we were able to encourage her to compare DNA with me as well. And she came back as my aunt. Now, initially, she's kind of blown out of the water about that, I think. She talked to her family and was like, we're not missing any children. Nobody gave anybody up. And that's understandable. I, on this side of things, have been searching for a while. So this, I'm kind of aware as new developments come up. But for people who are being approached with the fact that, hi, I'm part of your family, it's kind of surprising. Well, she did she's got two older sisters and 3 older brothers that live in Korea. And she talked to them, and it turned out that my father had gotten a young woman pregnant back in the early 1970s. And so they had a hunch that was me. So that brother, the youngest of her 3 brothers, and I compared DNA, and it came back as a child-parent match. And that's how I found out that my father was my father.
So from a young 20-year-old Ancestry.com cousin, you traced it all the way back through. How does the DNA, it's probably very simple, but I have no idea. How do you submit your DNA or register on these things? How does that work?
The most common way that it's done is by saliva collection. Okay. And they send you a little kit, and there's a plastic test tube, and you have to make yourself salivate and collect enough. Sometimes they do mouth swabs where they'll run it on the inside of your cheeks, and sometimes they'll do blood tests or hair tests. But the commercialized ones in the United States tend to be saliva.
It's quite interesting that something so powerful can be done so simply. I always imagine you have to go to hospitals and do all these things, but it's just that. What I've found fascinating is that in the United Kingdom, where I'm from, and perhaps parts of the United States as well, where you are, that this idea of ancestry and finding out lineage became very popular. On British television, we had all these celebrities going in and finding out they're quarter Jewish and half German and all of this, but it never became popular in South Korea. I think there's this idea of that one nation. You don't want to find out you're a little bit Chinese or Japanese because you're meant to be full Korean the whole time.
Right. There's a strong sense of nationalism, and it was a closed society for so long. Yeah. And then with the importance of patrilineal bloodlines, the purity of your Korean bloodline is really, really important, and it still is today.
I agree. We got to the part, where I lost track with saliva test. We got to the part where you found your father. What was it like when that information came back? And have you contacted him via email, or how was that part played out? The contact now with your father, Yung Hee.
I was pretty excited about it. The question was whether or not the family would be receptive to my existence. And in some cases with adoptees, the biological family doesn't want to be found, unfortunately. And that's really difficult. My family has been very welcoming and loving. The interesting thing, my dad never actually met me. So he knew that my mother was pregnant, but they separated before she was far along in her pregnancy. So he didn't know if she continued the birth, if I was a girl or a boy. So he never actually met me. Um, one of the things with regard to finding my father is the language barrier, of course. But of my father and his two older brothers and three younger sisters, his youngest sister, my Aunt Kyung, she knows English and she lives in the United States. So she's been translating our calls. And I've also got a good friend that's Korean American. He translates on some of our calls. We do video chat through Kakao. And it's really interesting talking to, like, you know, three aunts and an uncle and my dad all at the same time. But we've contacted pretty frequently. And it feels nice. We compare features, which is something that I only recently was able to do. And I'm pretty excited and looking forward to meeting everybody.
You said you compared features. I guess that would have been my next question. Like, can you, because I guess sometimes people won't immediately look like their mother, but when you see the whole family, you can see yourself in aunts and grandparents, and it kind of spreads, doesn't it? Have you noticed that? How do the features? Is it in the eyes or their hair or?
I feel like I definitely have my one aunt's lips. That was one of the things before I got us to compare DNA, before I convinced her. And I was comparing things. I was like, wow, I have her lips. And I tried to use that as a point to her to say that we were in fact related, but it took a little convincing. My father and I have the laugh lines that are very similar. And I have another aunt with the nose and another aunt with, I've got a small widow's peak. So I've got another aunt that's got one of those. And it's just amazing to be able to look into their faces and see these similarities.
Some people might be listening to this rather than watching our conversation. I must say your laugh lines are fantastic. It's great to have laugh lines. Despite this heavy conversation, you're generally just beaming throughout this, and I find it great. With your father's been able to provide some details that were previously missing, and this includes your mother's hometown, even her name, if I'm correct, Lee Geum Soon. What's happening with that part of the story there, Yung Hee?
He doesn't remember her exact name. It's either Lee Geum Soon or Lee Geum Sook.
Okay.
So we're trying to look into both of those. My father when my father was dating my mother, they lived in Seodaemun-gu. And so he's gone to the police there to see if he could find record of her. But they were only willing to look under one name. We couldn't just do can you check every name sort of situation. And unfortunately, they weren't able to find her. We're going to try to go back again with her second name and see if they'll give us another try. They pretty much implied it would be impossible to find someone with that name from that age range without doing a Korea-wide search. And unfortunately, they didn't seem to be really volunteering to do that. So we've been doing that. I've got a social media presence set up on like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. So I've been sending tweets out with information about my mom and how to contact me in case anybody's heard anything, or if my mother herself sees something or hears something. So hopefully we're getting the word spread there. And then I was recently on Yonhap News TV, and they ran a couple minute segment about my search as well. So we have, the information like where she lived, not the exact address, but the approximate area of where she lived in 1970. She's from Cheonan, Chungcheong province. Her name, as we've gone over. And also my father's nickname for her at the time was Mango.
That's quite cute.
So if she hears that,
yeah,
that should convince her.
And you're coming, you've said a couple of times, but you're coming to Seoul or to South Korea in the autumn. What do you hope happens in that trip? How long are you coming for? Is there a plan to try to find your mother, or are you just going to be spending time with your father? What happens on that trip, Yung Hee, when you come?
I'll be arriving at the end of September. and staying for 3 weeks. I'm going to, well, one, Yonhap News TV is going to be following me to film a documentary. And so I really, really hope that my mother, if we haven't heard anything by then, I really hope that my mother will see that. So that's one of my hopes. We're also going to go to her hometown and visit City Hall and the police station there to see if we can file a report. I really look forward to just spending quality time with my family and getting to know them. For example, we're going to go out to the countryside and visit the ancestral site. And I didn't have those relatives that long ago. So that's really meaningful for me. We're going to do a lot of eating and a lot of walking. And I look forward to that. And I also want to have more serious discussion with my dad about what his expectations are for me, because I'm actually the oldest child in the family. But before I was found, my half brother was the oldest child. So I don't know exactly what comes with the territory in that regard.
It must be lots of eating and walking, definitely in Korea. That's when it must be fascinating, despite being the stage of your life that you're at, sort of already a mother of two, perhaps the dates have gone, perhaps sort of late 40s by now, that all of a sudden the life is opening up these new chapters. You will be going to visit ancestral sites and things like that. It must be, we normally associate those things, I'm trying to say, Yung Hee, with youth and discovery and realizing that Santa Claus is not real. Sorry, listeners, but it must be weird that this is all happening to you at this stage of your life. I'm trying to
It's okay, because I feel like in many respects I've been a late bloomer. So I've done a lot of things on the somewhat late side of life, and that's okay. For example, some people be like, "Why'd you get married so late?" And I'm like, who would just get married just because there's a timeline to meet? You got to wait till you find the right person. And the same with having children. I had to do things when I was ready to do them. My upbringing was sort of unstable, and there was a lot of dysfunction in my family. So that time was spent being on the defensive and protecting myself rather than exploring who I was and discovering the world around me. So I've had to play catch up, just figuring out who I am and what I like and don't like in life and where I want to go with it. So I don't know, it feels strangely on track that things are coming at this time.
Yeah, they happen when they're meant to happen, perhaps. I'm really looking forward to not only seeing the documentary you'll make with Yonhap, but also from my experience with the elder Korean members of our family, they're more likely to be watching Yonhap news than they are on Twitter or Facebook, if you know what I mean. So I would hope that actually has some it opens up more windows, that, you know, elderly people are more likely to be watching the TV and see that documentary.
Yes.
What has the social media response been like for you? Because I mean, I came across your story, I believe it was on Twitter. I just saw this thing and I thought, wow, that's you know, it's not something I see amongst all the politics and all the noise and the negative stuff. I saw that and it kind of moved me and shocked me for a minute. What's been the social media response, Yung Hee, to your story?
It's been really good, but it's fleeting. So I've been watching the statistics, and there've been some pretty interesting spikes in terms of the foot traffic that's come to my website and people that are following me on Twitter and on YouTube. It's really exciting because it's literally been thousands of people. So that I just think of it as every person that stops on my website has the potential to say something or know somebody that might know my mother. So that's really encouraging. I had before my current website is UMA for USA. And it used to be, my old website was Red Pants, No Shoes. And that was from when I was found and what I was wearing. But I found over the years that didn't translate well to a Korean audience. So more recently, I switched to something that was a little simpler and easy to remember. But I had a spike back in 2010, back then, where the news stories first started catching wind of my search. And there was a Korea Times article about me searching for my birth family on Twitter. And that was pretty exciting at the time too. But then, you know, over the years, it's been 12 years since then, things have died down, but there's still been a really good response, and that's encouraging.
Yeah, and I genuinely hope the response continues. I think the documentary will really help. Do you have, perhaps, Yung Hee, a message for anyone out there that might be experiencing similar issues in terms of identity, adoption, or their past? You said every situation is unique, but there might be some people listening to this that see that and find similarities in there. Is there any kind of message or things that could be said? Because you seem to be dealing with it quite well, if I can say.
Well, I've had a few years to deal with it. I think the important thing is everybody's journey is individual. So you have to do what works for you. Don't let anybody else set the pace. There are some people that may never explore their Korean roots, and that's okay if that's what works for them. There are some people like me that want to have answers. And of course, I've delved into this over the years and found little pieces. It's been a really long search. And found little bits and pieces here and there as I go, but it's what you want to make of it, and don't let anybody tell you other than that. It's to sorry. Just that there's going to be ups and downs in life, and do the best you can to navigate them, and be there for yourself. Be there and show up for yourself, number one, more than you can count on anybody else. And eventually, hopefully you'll find your way through.
I like it. And I hope the people listening do as well. Yung Hee, I guess just before we ask this last question and bring this to a close, is there anything that we've missed in your story? Is there anything about it that needs to be said, or?
There's a lot out there about adoption, so I won't get into some of the more political issues. I guess one thing that I want to mention that's really important is that suicide rates for adopted people are 4 times higher than your average person, and that's really important for people to understand. There's a lot of difficulties and sometimes not good support and resources for helping especially young people navigate through these identity issues. And so for the people that can get past those tough times, I really commend their resilience and hope that other people will understand that being adopted is pretty complicated.
I've noticed in the past, I don't know, a decade or so, that identity has become a really key part of people's lives these days. I mean, I spend a lot of time with young 20-year-olds at universities all the time. When I was growing up, all my professors and teachers, masters, they told us, your identity doesn't matter, you treat everybody the same. That was the kind of ethos of the 80s and 90s when I grew up. But now there does seem to be this focus on your identity and who you are and where you're from. And so just hearing you explain that, how adopted people, and that puts this whole kind of extra pressure on them, I guess, and that, yeah, to commend that resilience is an important thing. I just want to say thank you one more time, Yung Hee, for for sharing it, because it must not be easy, but I think it's an important conversation, and I've really enjoyed talking to you today. I end all of my conversations with the same question, so this will be the last question, which is that we're all in this world together. We're all going through this life. We all have different starting points and things like that, but what can we do to make life more valuable, either for us or for other people? Yung Hee, what is the meaning of life?
I don't know about the meaning of life. That's a tough question, but I do have a response to how we can provide more value to our lives and the lives of others. And that is, I believe the best way we can do that is to become the best versions of ourselves. And by that, I mean, take good care of yourself. Regardless of how your life began, either before adoption or since it, we all have, we have very little say in what kind of family that we're raised in. But do your best to overcome trauma and pain that you've encountered, and observe life around you rather than instinctually react to it. It's important to teach yourself that you can always count on you, even when you can't count on other people. If you need counseling, get counseling. If you need to take medication, get decent rest, get adequate physical exercise, eat healthily so you can be best equipped to handle whatever life throws at you. Make the effort to work through the negative things in your life, and really feel them, because you can't let them go until you process them, and you've got to do the hard work of processing them first. Don't hold on to these things and just let them eat you up inside. It's just so destructive. Strive for balance in your life so you can experience the highs and cope with the lows. When you're your best self, you can give that to others, and that ideally is what makes the good in the world so worth it.
It's one of the best answers I've had to that last question in a long time, and I think it's important because it feels like that you walk the walk and talk to you live by those values. I guess, having looked at your story and what you're doing, this is not just 좋은 말씀 or nice expressions, but it feels like that you are embodying that advice yourself.
I'm trying. It's taken many years of therapy and introspection, but I'm trying to really be here for my family and to be the best version of myself I can be.
Yeah, and long may it continue. I'll do the same for my family. Yung Hee, thank you for this.
You're welcome. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.